The crack of a pistol shattered the morning air as Caroline Norwood felt herself being shoved roughly toward the waiting wagon, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit painfully into her skin, and the taste of betrayal bitter on her tongue. "Get moving, girl," snarled the rail-thin man called Silas, his tobacco-stained teeth visible beneath his unkempt mustache as he prodded her forward with the barrel of his gun. "Your uncle paid good money to see you shipped off to Oregon Territory, and I aim to deliver." Natalie Finch swallowed back tears of rage as she stumbled toward the canvas-covered wagon. At 22 years old, she had never imagined her life in Boston would end like this, kidnapped by bounty hunters hired by her own uncle, George Pennington, who had wasted no time in claiming her deceased father's estate and disposing of the only heir who stood in his way. "Please," she pleaded, turning to face the three men who had ambushed her outside her dressmaking shop 2 weeks earlier. "There must be some mistake. I have a business, a life in Boston. You cannot simply force me onto a wagon train heading west." The oldest of the three men, a weather-beaten fellow named Hobbs, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Sorry, miss, we've got our orders. Your uncle says you're unstable after your pa's death. Says you need a fresh start out west with distant relatives." "That's a lie." Natalie's voice broke with frustration. "My uncle is stealing my inheritance. Can you not see that?" The third man, young and nervous with a pockmarked face, averted his eyes. "Ain't our business to question, we just deliver." It was April 1858, and the spring wagon train to Oregon Territory was preparing to depart from Independence, Missouri. Natalie had been transported across half the country already, kept under constant guard, her protests ignored by everyone she encountered. Her once fine traveling dress was now soiled and torn, her honey blonde hair falling from its pins, and her blue eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and tears. As she was forced toward the wagon, Natalie saw the sympathetic glances from the women of the wagon train, but none dared intervene. These were hard people embarking on a harder journey, and they had their own concerns. "Wagon master says you'll be traveling with the widow Jenkins," Silas informed her, gesturing toward a somber-looking wagon near the front of the line. "She needs help with her young'uns, and you need watching." "Seems a fair arrangement." Natalie opened her mouth to protest again when a commotion erupted at the edge of the camp. A tall man on horseback had ridden in at a gallop, drawing the attention of everyone in the vicinity. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements speaking of ease and confidence despite the trail dust that covered his form. "Hold up there," the stranger's voice carried across the camp with authority. He strode toward them, spurs jingling with each step, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "What's going on here?" Silas straightened, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "None of your concern, mister. Private business." The stranger pushed his hat back, revealing a face bronzed by sun and weather, with eyes the color of a summer storm. He was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "I believe it is my concern," he said evenly, his gaze moving to Natalie's bound wrists before returning to Silas with newfound intensity. "Especially when it involves my bride." A stunned silence fell over the small gathering. Natalie stared at the stranger, confusion warring with a desperate spark of hope. "Your bride," Silas sputtered, looking between Natalie and the newcomer. "That ain't possible. This here is Natalie Finch, niece to George Pennington of Boston. We've been hired to see her safely to Oregon Territory." The stranger stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "Then you've been fed a pack of lies, friend. This woman is Natalie Finch all right, but she's promised to me Beckett Blackwood, rancher out of Willow Creek. We've been corresponding for months. I've got the letters to prove it." He patted the breast pocket of his coat. Natalie held her breath, unsure whether to contradict this bold lie or play along with what might be her only chance at escape. "She never mentioned no fiancé," Hobbs said suspiciously. Beckett Blackwood's expression hardened. "Probably because she knew her uncle wouldn't approve. Man's been trying to control her inheritance since her father passed. Even tried to have her declared incompetent, from what I understand." Natalie's eyes widened. How could this stranger know about her situation? I rode all the way from Willow Creek when I heard she might be on this wagon train, Beckett continued. Been tracking you for 3 days. Silas's hand hovered near his gun. We've got papers, forged, no doubt, Beckett interrupted, his voice cool. I've got papers too, including a marriage license ready to be signed and dated. He reached slowly into his coat, withdrawing several folded documents. Plus, I've got the sheriff of Willow Creek who can vouch for me. What do you have? The word of a man who stands to gain a fortune if his niece disappears. The 3 men exchanged uncertain glances. This complication clearly hadn't been part of their plan. How do we know you're telling the truth? Silas demanded, though his confidence was visibly wavering. Beckett's gaze shifted to Natalie, something unspoken passing between them, a plea perhaps, or a promise. Natalie, he said gently, tell these men who I am. Heart pounding, Natalie made her decision. This is Beckett Blackwood, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. My fiancé. We've been planning to marry once I settled my father's affairs. She met his eyes, silently thanking him for this unexpected intervention. I didn't tell my uncle about our engagement. I should have, but I feared his reaction. Beckett stepped forward and placed a protective arm around her shoulders. Now, gentlemen, I'd appreciate it if you'd untie my bride-to-be. Unless you'd prefer I summon the wagon master and the 12 men who owe me favors to help settle this matter, the threat hung in the air. Several onlookers had gathered, watching the confrontation with interest. Silas glanced around, clearly calculating his odds. Your uncle paid us half up front, he finally said, directing his words to Natalie. We don't get the rest until we deliver you to Oregon. I'll compensate you for your trouble, Beckett offered, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small leather pouch. He tossed it to Silas, who caught it with a surprised expression. That should cover your expenses getting here. Now cut her loose and be on your way. The weight of the gold in the pouch proved persuasive. With a reluctant nod, Silas motioned to the young man, who stepped forward with a knife and sliced through the ropes binding Natalie's wrists. She rubbed the raw skin gratefully, still scarcely believing this turn of events. You're making a mistake, Silas warned, tucking the pouch away. Pennington won't take this lightly. Pennington isn't here, Beckett replied, and if he has any sense, he'll stay in Boston where he belongs. The 3 men retreated, muttering among themselves. Natalie watched them go, trembling with relief and uncertainty. When they were out of earshot, she turned to her unexpected savior. Thank you, she whispered, studying his face more carefully now. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with a certain weathered dignity about him. But why did you help me? Who are you really? Beckett Blackwood's expression softened as he gently guided her away from the curious onlookers. The explanation's a bit complicated, Miss Finch. Let's find somewhere quieter to talk. He led her to a campfire on the outskirts of the wagon train, where a coffee pot bubbled over the flames. An older man with a silver-streaked beard nodded to them but maintained a respectful distance. Beckett poured her a cup of the strong brew and handed it to her. Drink this. You look like you could use it. Natalie accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. You still haven't answered my question, Mr. Blackwood. He settled beside her on a fallen log. I wasn't entirely dishonest back there. I am Beckett Blackwood, and I do have a ranch near Willow Creek, about 3 days' ride from here. As for how I knew about your situation. He paused, looking somewhat embarrassed. Your father's lawyer, Nathaniel Whiting, is my cousin. When he learned what your uncle was planning, he sent word to me. Natalie nearly spilled her coffee. Mr. Whiting, but he disappeared right after the reading of my father's will. I thought perhaps my uncle had. She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. Nathaniel's fine. He went into hiding when he realized what your uncle was capable of. He's been gathering evidence of George Pennington's forgeries and manipulations. Beckett's expression darkened. What I didn't expect was that your uncle would hire men to physically remove you from Boston before the case could be brought before a judge. Neither did I, Natalie said bitterly. They came at night, claimed they were the law. By the time I realized they weren't, we were already halfway to New York. She shuddered at the memory. But why would Mr. Whiting contact you specifically? Beckett removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. Nathaniel knew I'd be nearby. I was in Kansas City on business. He also knew I. He hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck. He knew I'd be inclined to help. Inclined to help a complete stranger, Natalie pressed, sensing there was more to the story. Beckett met her gaze directly. Your father and I had business dealings. I purchased horses from him several times over the years. He spoke of you often proudly. When Nathaniel told me you were in trouble, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. It wasn't right. Natalie studied him, trying to reconcile this revelation with her memories. I don't recall my father mentioning you. A ghost of a smile touched Beckett's lips. I doubt he would have. Our dealings were mainly through correspondence, though we met in person twice. The last time was about 3 years ago. 3 years ago. Natalie had been away at school then, completing her education at a ladies' seminary in New York. It made sense that she wouldn't have met her father's business associate. So what happens now? She asked, the reality of her situation settling in. Those men may be gone, but I'm still thousands of miles from home with no money and no way to get back to Boston to fight my uncle's claims. Beckett's expression grew serious. That's what we need to discuss. There are a few options, none of them perfect. He glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. The safest would be for you to come to Willow Creek with me. It's a small town, but growing. You'd be beyond your uncle's immediate reach while Nathaniel builds the case against him. And the other options. You could continue with the wagon train as planned, but without those men watching you. Once you reach Oregon, you could contact the authorities there. He frowned. Though I wouldn't recommend it. The journey is dangerous, and your uncle might have associates waiting at the other end. Natalie considered this, weighing her limited choices. And what about? She hesitated, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. What about your claim that I'm your bride? Won't people expect us to marry now? To her surprise, Beckett looked genuinely contrite. I apologize for that deception. It seemed the quickest way to get those men to release you. He cleared his throat. We can tell people the engagement was broken amicably once we reach Willow Creek. No one there knows about this. Arrangement. Relief mingled with an unexpected twinge of disappointment. I see. But, he continued carefully, for your protection on the journey, it might be best if we maintain the pretense until we reach town. Those men might still be watching, and other travelers will be less likely to question your presence if they believe you're traveling with your fiancé. The logic was sound, even if the situation was entirely improper. Natalie considered what her father would say about her traveling unchaperoned with a man she barely knew, even one who had come to her rescue, but these were desperate times. Very well, Mr. Blackwood. It seems I have little choice but to accept your assistance. She straightened her shoulders, summoning what dignity she could. But I want your word that you'll help me return to Boston as soon as it's safe to do so. I have no intention of abandoning my father's legacy to a thief, even if that thief is my own blood. Beckett nodded solemnly. You have my word, Miss Finch. He extended his hand to her. Partners in this deception, then. Natalie hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his much larger one. His palm was warm and callous, the hand of a man who worked for his living. Partners, Mr. Blackwood. As they shook on their unusual agreement, neither could have anticipated how their lives would entwine in the weeks to come, nor how a pretend engagement born of necessity would blossom into something neither had been seeking. The journey to Willow Creek began at dawn the following day. Beckett had procured a sturdy wagon and a team of 4 horses, loading it with supplies and creating a small sheltered space in the back where Natalie could rest. He'd also purchased her new clothing, simple, practical garments that were a far cry from her Boston finery, but infinitely more comfortable for travel than her tattered dress. The terrain gets rough after we leave the main trail, Beckett explained as they set out, the wagon train to Oregon continuing north while they turned west. I'd offer you a horse of your own, but I think the wagon will be more comfortable, at least until you've had time to recover your strength. Natalie wasn't about to argue. The 2 weeks of forced travel with her captors had left her exhausted and sore. The simple luxury of clean clothes, adequate food, and not having her hands bound was enough to make her nearly weep with gratitude. As they traveled, Beckett proved to be a considerate companion. He kept a respectful distance at night, sleeping under the stars while insisting she take the shelter of the wagon. During the day, he pointed out landmarks and wildlife, sharing stories of the territory they passed through with the ease of a man who knew the land intimately. "How long have you lived in the West?" Natalie asked on their second day, as they stopped to rest the horses beside a clear-running stream. Beckett was checking the shoes on one of the horses, his movements gentle but sure. "Since I was 18, that's nearly 12 years now." He straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "I came out with nothing but a good horse and the clothes on my back, worked as a ranch hand then a foreman. Saved every penny until I could buy my own place." "That's impressive," Natalie said sincerely, building something from nothing. A shadow crossed his features. "I had help along the way, good people who gave me chances I might not have deserved." There was a story there, Natalie sensed, but Beckett changed the subject, asking about her life in Boston instead. She told him about her father's shipping business, her education, and her small dressmaking shop that she'd started after returning from school. "I wanted to prove I could make my own way," she explained. "Father didn't understand at first. He wanted me to marry well to secure my future through a good match. But after Mother died, I think he realized I needed something of my own." "He sounds like a good man," Beckett observed. He was. Natalie's throat tightened with grief. His death was so sudden, a riding accident. One moment he was there and the next. She trailed off, unable to continue. Beckett's hand settled briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that required no words. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "Your shop, was it successful?" Grateful for the change in topic, Natalie nodded. "Very much so. I had a talent for creating fashionable designs that were also practical. Women appreciated that." Pride crept into her voice. "I was just beginning to expand when all this happened." "Perhaps you could start again in Willow Creek," Beckett suggested. "The town is growing. The women there would welcome someone with your skills." The idea hadn't occurred to Natalie. "I hadn't thought of that. I've been so focused on getting back to Boston." "It would give you an occupation while we wait for Nathaniel to build his case," Beckett pointed out. "And an income of your own." Independence had always been important to Natalie. Even now, accepting Beckett's help made her uncomfortable, necessary though it was. "I wouldn't want to impose on your hospitality longer than necessary." A faint smile touched his lips. "Having a dressmaker in town would hardly be an imposition, Miss Finch. Willow Creek could use more enterprising women like yourself." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Beckett," he corrected. "If we're supposed to be engaged, you should probably use my given name." "Then you must call me Natalie," she replied, testing the new familiarity between them. "Natalie," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Their journey continued through increasingly rugged country. Beckett proved to be not only a skilled horseman, but also a capable hunter, bringing back game for their evening meals. He taught Natalie how to build a proper campfire and how to identify edible plants along the trail. On the evening of the third day, as they made camp in a sheltered valley, a spring storm blew in without warning. The sky darkened ominously, and within minutes, rain was pouring down in sheets. "Get in the wagon," Beckett shouted over the sudden roar of thunder. He worked quickly to secure the horses while Natalie scrambled to gather their cooking supplies. By the time Beckett joined her in the wagon, they were both soaked to the skin. The small space felt suddenly intimate as they huddled together, listening to the rain hammer against the canvas covering. "So much for our fire tonight," Beckett said ruefully, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. Natalie shivered, her damp clothes clinging uncomfortably. Beckett noticed immediately and reached for a woolen blanket stored in one corner. "Here," he said, offering it to her. "You should change into something dry before you catch your death." Natalie clutched the blanket gratefully, but looked around the confined space with uncertainty. Understanding dawned in Beckett's eyes. "Of course, I'll wait outside." "But you're soaked as well," she protested, genuinely concerned. "You'll be ill," he smiled reassuringly. "I've weathered worse. I'll be fine under the wagon until you're done." Before she could argue further, he ducked out into the rain. Natalie changed quickly, hanging her wet garments from the wagon bows to dry. When she was decent again, wrapped in the blanket with a dry dress beneath, she called for Beckett to return. He climbed back in, water streaming from his hat and coat. Without thinking, Natalie reached for the second blanket and handed it to him. "Your turn," she said firmly. "I'll look away." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, but he nodded, accepting the blanket. Natalie turned her back, fixing her gaze on the canvas wall of the wagon while listening to the rustle of fabric as Beckett changed. The wagon was small enough that she could sense his movements, the warmth of him just inches away. "Decent now," he said after a moment. When she turned back, he had removed his wet shirt and coat, but still wore his trousers, though he draped the blanket around his shoulders. In the dim light filtering through the canvas, she could see the strong lines of his chest and shoulders before he adjusted the blanket to cover himself more fully. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the continuous drumming of rain and occasional rumble of thunder. "Do you think the storm will pass soon?" Natalie asked, desperate for conversation to distract from their unusual proximity. Beckett shook his head. "Not likely. Spring storms in these parts can last through the night." He settled back against a crate, creating as much distance between them as the small space allowed. "Try to get some rest. I'll keep watch." "Keep watch for what?" Natalie asked, curious. "Force of habit," he admitted with a slight smile. "Out here it pays to stay alert." "Have you encountered much danger in your travels?" The question had been on her mind since they'd left the wagon train. Beckett considered this. "Some. Mostly wild animals, the occasional desperate drifter. The real dangers out west are more ordinary sickness, accidents, bad weather." He nodded toward the storm raging outside. "Nature doesn't care who you are or what your plans might be." "That's rather philosophical, Mr. B.L. Beckett," Natalie observed. He chuckled softly. "Spend enough nights under the stars and you start to ponder things." "What sorts of things?" She pressed, finding herself genuinely interested in this man's thoughts. Beckett was quiet for a moment, and Natalie thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. "The kind of life worth building, the kind of man worth becoming." He met her eyes briefly. "My father was not a good man, Natalie. When I left home, I swore I'd be different." The personal revelation surprised her. "And have you succeeded?" "I try," he said simply. "Every day I try." Something in his honest answer touched her deeply. Here was a man who had faced his demons and chosen a different path, who was still choosing it, day by day. It made her own determination to reclaim her father's legacy seem all the more important. "I think," she said carefully, "that the very fact you ask yourself these questions proves you're already different from your father." Beckett's expression softened. "That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, just observation." Natalie pulled her blanket tighter. "A truly bad man wouldn't have ridden for 3 days to rescue a woman he barely knew." Their eyes met across the dim wagon, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Two people who understood what it meant to fight for what was right, even when the path forward wasn't clear. The storm continued through the night, but inside the wagon, a different kind of warmth had begun to grow. Dawn broke clear and bright after the storm, the landscape washed clean and vibrant. They made good time that day, the horses refreshed from their enforced rest. By mid-afternoon, Beckett pointed to a distant line of hills. "Willow Creek lies just beyond those ridges," he told Natalie. "We should reach town by nightfall." Natalie felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension. The journey had been challenging but also oddly freeing. For these few days, she had existed outside the constraints of society, sharing a simple, honest connection with Beckett that would inevitably change once they reached civilization. "What should I expect?" she asked. "From the town, I mean," Beckett considered this. "Willow Creek is small but growing. About 500 souls, give or take. We've got a general store, a hotel, church, schoolhouse, and 3 saloons." He smiled slightly at her raised eyebrow. "The railroad's coming through next year, so everyone's anticipating a boom. And your ranch." "Is it in town?" "About 3 miles outside, along the creek that gave the town its name. Good water, good grazing land." Pride colored his voice. "I've built it up from 200 acres to nearly 1,000 now, mostly cattle, but I keep a remuda of fine horses too." It sounds lovely, Natalie said sincerely. Beckett glanced at her, his expression turning serious. About our arrangement, once we reach town, questions will be asked. People will be curious about my fiancé. Natalie nodded, understanding his concern. What do you suggest we tell them? The simplest stories are easiest to maintain, he said. We could say we met through your father's business, corresponded for a time, and agreed to marry. When your father died and your uncle became troublesome, you decided to come west earlier than planned. And our broken engagement. She asked. How will we explain that? Beckett frowned slightly. We don't need to rush that part. It might be safer if people believe we're still engaged while your uncle's men might be looking for you. We can say we're taking time to know each other better before setting a date. It was sensible, if somewhat daunting to contemplate maintaining such a pretense. Very well, and where will I stay? I can hardly reside at your ranch if we're only engaged. I've thought about that, Beckett said. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, has a small cottage on my property. She's visiting her daughter in St. Louis and won't return for at least 2 months. You could stay there with propriety maintained but still under my protection. Relief flooded through Natalie. That sounds perfect. And perhaps I could look into establishing my dressmaking business, as you suggested. I think that would be wise, Beckett agreed. The women of Willow Creek would certainly appreciate it, and it would give you a natural way to integrate into the community. As they approached the town, Natalie felt herself growing increasingly nervous. What if the people of Willow Creek didn't accept her? What if Beckett's reputation suffered because of their deception? What if her uncle's men tracked her here? Sensing her anxiety, Beckett reached across from his position on the driver's seat and briefly covered her hand with his own. It will be all right, Natalie. These are good people. They'll welcome you. His touch was reassuring, his confidence contagious. Natalie straightened her shoulders and nodded. She had survived worse than this already. She could certainly manage a small western town. Willow Creek came into view as they crested a final hill. The settlement spread along a winding creek, with buildings clustered near the water and scattered outward into the surrounding countryside. In the fading light, windows glowed warmly, and smoke rose from chimneys against the twilight sky. It's larger than I expected, Natalie observed. Growing every month, Beckett replied with evident pride. That's the main street there, with the general store and hotel. The white building with the steeple is the church, and beyond it is the schoolhouse. As they rode down the main street, heads turned. Clearly, Beckett's return with an unknown woman was causing a stir. Several people called greetings, which Beckett returned with a wave and a promise to catch up soon. They stopped first at the general store, where Beckett introduced Natalie to the proprietor, a jovial man named Samuel Harrigan, and his wife, Martha. So you're the young lady who finally caught our Beckett, Martha said warmly, clasping Natalie's hands in her own. We've been telling him for years he needs a good woman, haven't we, Samuel? That we have, Samuel agreed, shaking Beckett's hand vigorously. Though you kept this courtship mighty quiet, my friend. Beckett's arm slipped around Natalie's waist in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. Some things are worth keeping private until the time is right. Natalie felt herself blushing at the easy way he embraced their fiction, and at how natural it felt to be standing so close to him. Will you be staying in town, Miss Finch? Martha asked. Natalie will be staying at Mrs. Abernathy's cottage until she returns, Beckett explained. We thought it more proper given the circumstances. Martha nodded approvingly. Very sensible. Though you won't lack for dinner invitations, I assure you. Everyone will want to meet Beckett Blackwood's intended. They made several more stops at the hotel to arrange for a hot bath to be prepared for Natalie. At the telegraph office, where Beckett sent a message to his foreman announcing their arrival. And finally at a small dress shop run by an elderly widow named Mrs. Fletcher. Natalie is a skilled dressmaker, Beckett told the woman. Perhaps you might have some insights for her about setting up shop here in Willow Creek. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes lit up. Oh, my dear, would you really consider it? I'm getting too old for all this sewing, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. The ladies here would be ecstatic to have someone with fresh ideas and young eyes. By the time they left town and headed toward Beckett's ranch, Natalie felt overwhelmed but cautiously optimistic. The people of Willow Creek had been welcoming, accepting Beckett's introduction of her without question. No one had seemed suspicious of their sudden engagement, and several women had already expressed interest in her dressmaking services. The ranch itself took Natalie's breath away. As they approached in the deepening twilight, she could make out a substantial two-story house built of hewn logs and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Lanterns had been lit to welcome them home, their golden light spilling across the yard. Several men emerged from a bunkhouse as they approached, calling greetings to Beckett and eyeing Natalie with undisguised curiosity. "Boys, this is Miss Natalie Finch, my fiancé," Beckett announced, helping Natalie down from the wagon. "Natalie, these are some of my ranch hands. That ugly fellow there is my foreman, Hank Miller." A weathered man with a salt and pepper beard stepped forward, removing his hat. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Finch. Boss never mentioned he was courting a lady, but we're mighty glad to see he's finally settling down." The other men murmured agreement, all of them displaying the rough courtesy of men who respected their employer. Natalie smiled, finding their genuine welcome touching. "Thank you for the kind reception," she said. "I look forward to getting to know all of you." Beckett helped her settle into Mrs. Abernathy's cottage, a snug one-room cabin near the main house. It was simple but clean, with a comfortable bed, a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the window. Someone had filled a vase with wildflowers and left it on the table, a thoughtful touch that brought tears to Natalie's tired eyes. "Will this be comfortable enough?" Beckett asked, watching her reaction carefully. "It's perfect," she assured him, meaning it. After weeks of forced travel and sleeping outdoors, the small cottage seemed luxurious. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." Beckett looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I've done what anyone would do." "No," Natalie said firmly. "Not anyone would ride for days to rescue a stranger, offer them shelter, and help them establish a new life. You're an exceptional man, Beckett Blackwood." Color rose in his cheeks. "I should let you rest. You must be exhausted." He moved toward the door but paused with his hand on the latch. "I'll come by in the morning to show you around the ranch. Perhaps afterward we could ride into town and you could speak with Mrs. Fletcher about the dressmaking business." "I'd like that very much." After he left, Natalie sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by all that had happened. Just a week ago, she had been a prisoner, bound for Oregon territory against her will. Now she was in a cozy cottage, preparing to establish herself in a new town, with a man she barely knew yet already trusted implicitly. It was a strange twist of fate, but perhaps, she thought as she drifted toward sleep, not an entirely unwelcome one. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Beckett helped Natalie establish her dressmaking business in town. Mrs. Fletcher was delighted to sell her small shop to Natalie, eager to retire, but relieved that the town's women wouldn't be left without a seamstress. With Beckett's assistance, Natalie secured a small loan from the local bank to purchase the shop and necessary supplies. Word spread quickly about the new dressmaker's skill, and soon Natalie found herself with more orders than she could handle alone. She hired 2 young women as assistant sisters named Rachel and Ruth Davis, whose nimble fingers and quick learning made them invaluable. Beckett, meanwhile, continued running his ranch but made time to call on Natalie each day, maintaining their pretense of courtship. What began as an act for the benefit of the townspeople, however, gradually evolved into something more genuine. They took their meals together when possible, attended church side by side on Sundays, and spent quiet evenings on the porch of Mrs. Abernathy's cottage, talking until the stars came out. "Tell me about your dreams," Natalie asked one evening in late May as they sat watching fireflies dance over the meadow. "Before all this before me, what were you working toward?" Beckett considered the question, his profile thoughtful in the fading light. "I wanted to build something lasting. Something I could be proud of." He gestured toward the ranch spread out before them. "This land, when I bought it, was little more than scrub and rocks. Now it's one of the most productive spreads in the territory." "You've accomplished a great deal," Natalie observed. "Anyone would be proud. And yet there's always more to do." He turned to look at her, his expression earnest. A ranch needs a future, a next generation to carry it forward. I've built all this, but without family, what's the point? The implication hung in the air between them. Natalie's heart quickened. You want children, someday, with the right woman. His gaze lingered on her face. What about you? What were your dreams in Boston? Natalie looked out over the land, gathering her thoughts. Independence primarily, the freedom to make my own choices, build my own life. She smiled ruefully. My father wanted me to marry someone established, someone safe. And you didn't want that. I wanted love, she admitted quietly. Not just security or position. I saw too many women in Boston trapped in loveless marriages, withering away behind proper facades. I promised myself I wouldn't become one of them. Beckett's hand found hers in the growing darkness, his touch warm and reassuring. A wise decision. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, each lost in their own thoughts. When Beckett finally rose to leave, he bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, their first physical contact beyond the occasional guiding hand or steadying arm. "Good night, Natalie," he murmured. "Good night, Beckett," she replied, her skin tingling where his lips had touched. As she watched him walk back to the main house, Natalie realized with startling clarity that what had begun as a necessary deception had become something far more complicated. She was falling in love with Beckett Blackwood, a man who had offered her protection and friendship, but who had never spoken of actual love. What would happen, she wondered, when it was time for their pretend engagement to end? The answer came sooner than expected. In early June, a telegram arrived from Nathaniel Whiting, Beckett's cousin and Natalie's father's lawyer. Beckett brought it directly to Natalie's shop, his expression grave. "Nathaniel has news," he said without preamble, once they were alone in the back room of the dress shop. "Your uncle has been arrested in Boston. They found evidence that he forged your father's will and attempted to have you declared incompetent without due process." Natalie sank into a chair, the news hitting her like a physical blow. "So it's over, I can go home, if that's what you want." Beckett's voice was carefully neutral. "Nathaniel says your father's estate will be released to you once the legal proceedings are complete. That could take a few more months, but your presence isn't required in Boston yet." "I see." Natalie twisted her hands in her lap, emotions warring within her. Relief that her uncle would face justice, satisfaction that her father's legacy would be preserved, but also reluctance. The thought of leaving Willow Creek, of leaving Beckett, filled her with unexpected dread. "There's something else," Beckett continued, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder. "With your uncle apprehended, there's no longer any need for our arrangement. You're safe now. You can make your own decisions about your future." The implications were clear. Their pretend engagement could end, should end by all proper standards. Natalie would be free to return to Boston to reclaim her life there. "I see," she repeated, unable to find better words. An awkward silence fell between them, heavier than any they had shared before. "What will you tell people?" Natalie finally asked. "About the broken engagement," Beckett shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Whatever you think best, that we realized we weren't suited, that you miss your life in Boston, is that what you want?" Natalie interrupted, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "To end our engagement." He looked at her then, really looked at her, something vulnerable flickering in his gray eyes. "What I want hasn't changed since the day I brought you to Willow Creek, Natalie. But what I want isn't the only consideration." Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Perhaps you should tell me what you want then, so I can consider it alongside my own wishes." Beckett moved closer, kneeling before her chair so they were at eye level. "I want you to stay," he said simply. "Not because you need protection, not because of some arrangement between us, but because you want to be here, with me." Natalie's breath caught. "Are you proposing Beckett Blackwood?" A smile touched his lips. "I believe I already did that, in front of the entire Wagon train. But yes, I'm asking you properly now. I love you, Natalie Finch. I think I started falling in love with you that first day, when you had the courage to play along with a stranger's outrageous lie because you recognized it as your best chance at freedom." Tears welled in Natalie's eyes. "I thought it was just pretend for you." "It was, at first," he admitted. "But not for long." His hands enveloped hers, warm and solid. I understand if your heart is still in Boston. You have a life there, a legacy to reclaim. I wouldn't ask you to give that up. Natalie looked around the small workroom of her shop, thinking of the business she was building, the friends she had made, the community that had welcomed her. She thought of quiet evenings on the porch and the way her heart leapt whenever Beckett rode into town. My father's legacy is important to me, she said slowly, but perhaps I can honor it in ways he never anticipated. She met Beckett's gaze steadily. I love you too, Beckett. I want to stay in Willow Creek with you. The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the hills. He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. Are you certain? I don't want you to have regrets. The only thing I would regret is leaving when my heart is here. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. Besides, I have a thriving business, loyal customers, and a beautiful cottage to call home. Why would I leave all that behind? The cottage is yours for as long as you want it, Beckett said, a mischievous glint appearing in his eyes. Though I was rather hoping you might consider moving into the main house after the wedding. Natalie laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her. That could be arranged, I suppose, though Mrs. Abernathy might be surprised to find me installed as mistress of the house when she returns. Mrs. Abernathy has been telling me to find a wife for years, Beckett replied, drawing her closer. She'll be delighted. Their first real kiss was everything Natalie had dreamed it might be, tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Beckett pressed his forehead to hers. From pretend to real, he murmured. Not the conventional way to find a bride, but I wouldn't change a moment of it. Nor would I, Natalie agreed, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. They were married 3 weeks later in the white clapboard church on the hill, with the entire town in attendance. Nathaniel Whiting made the journey from Boston to give the bride away, bringing with him papers that secured Natalie's inheritance. Most of it, she decided, would remain invested in her father's shipping company, with a portion set aside to expand her dressmaking business in Willow Creek. Your father would be proud, Nathaniel told her at the wedding reception. Not just of how you've handled the business matters, but of the life you're creating here. He always wanted your happiness above all else. I am happy, Natalie replied, watching Beckett across the room as he laughed with his ranch hands. Happier than I ever imagined possible. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. Natalie's business flourished, eventually expanding to include a millinery section and imported fabrics that made Willow Creek a destination for women throughout the territory. Beckett's ranch prospered as well, his breeding program producing horses sought after by buyers as far away as California. They turned the small cottage where Natalie had first stayed into a schoolroom when their daughter, Julia, was born 2 years after their marriage. By the time their son, James, arrived 2 years later, the railroad had reached Willow Creek, bringing growth and opportunity to the once small town. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Beckett surprised Natalie with a journey back east, not to Boston, but to New York, where they attended the opera and dined in fine restaurants. It was Natalie's first return to civilization since her forced departure years earlier. Do you miss it? Beckett asked as they stood on the balcony of their hotel, looking out over the glittering city. The refinement, the culture. Natalie considered the question seriously, then shook her head. I appreciate visiting, but no, Willow Creek is home now. She leaned into his embrace. Though I wouldn't mind bringing back a few luxuries, some books perhaps, a proper piano for the children. Whatever you want, Beckett promised, kissing the top of her head. I'd give you the world if I could. I don't need the world, Natalie replied simply. I have everything I need in Willow Creek. They returned home laden with gifts for the children and treasures for their growing house. The ranch had expanded to include not only cattle and horses, but also orchards and gardens that made it nearly self-sufficient. Natalie had become as skilled at managing the household accounts as she was at designing fashionable gowns. And together, she and Beckett had created a home known for its warmth and hospitality. 10 years after their marriage, on a golden autumn evening much like the one when Beckett had first proposed, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard with the family dog. Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out? Natalie asked, her head resting against Beckett's shoulder. If my uncle hadn't been so greedy, if you hadn't happened to be in Kansas City when Nathaniel needed help. I try not to dwell on might-have-beens, Beckett replied, his arm tightening around her. But I do thank God every day for bringing you into my life, even if the circumstances were less than ideal. Natalie smiled, remembering the terrified young woman she had been, bound for Oregon against her will. I was so frightened when those men forced me onto that wagon. I never could have imagined it would lead me to the greatest happiness I've ever known. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives open doors to the best, Beckett observed, though I'd prefer if all our future doors opened without quite so much drama. Natalie laughed, the sound mingling with the children's playful shouts and the distant lowing of cattle. This was her life now, far from the refined drawing rooms of Boston, but richer and more fulfilling than anything she had imagined for herself. As the sun set over the hills of Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Natalie silently thanked the strange twist of fate that had forced her onto a wagon heading west. That journey of desperation had led her not to exile, but to home, to Beckett, to family, to a love that had begun as pretense, but had grown into the most genuine truth of her life. In the deepening twilight, Beckett turned to her, his eyes still holding the same warmth they had shown on that first day when he had claimed her as his bride. "I love you, Natalie Blackwood," he murmured, the words familiar but never routine. "And I love you," she replied, leaning up to kiss him as their children's laughter echoed across the ranch. They had built together a home and a legacy that would endure long after them, born from what had once been nothing more than a desperate lie and a chance at freedom.